This is the lecture, part one for the lecture on protist, which is in Unit 3 of our class. Let me set this slideshow up, sorry. So this title page. So this is the unit or chapter on protist. And I wanted to do a quick review with you so you can understand where the protists fall in the classifying living things. So we learned that there are 3 domains of living things. Our first chapter was on viruses, which I won't write on this page because viruses are not technically living things. Because they are not cells and they do not reproduce without a host cell. So we have 3 domains of living things, 3 major groups that living things are categorized as. The bacteria and the archaea are both prokaryotic and they're both unicellular. So every organism in the domain bacteria and every organism in the domain archaea is unicellular and prokaryotic, meaning the cells do not have a nucleus. But the third domain, eukarya, is divided into 3 kingdoms. And 3 of the kingdoms are common. It's divided into the kingdom plant or plantae, animalia, fungi, and the last group is pretty much anything in the eukarya that is not a plant, animal, or fungus. Okay, so on this page it says protist is the catch-all term for eukaryotic organisms that are not animal, plant, or fungi. This is literally a catch-all group. But there are 2 main types of protists. There's algae and then small organisms called protozoans. But anyway, it says very few characteristics are common to all protists. There are over 100,000 described living species of protists, and it's unclear how many undescribed species may exist. Many protists live as commensals or parasites in other organisms, and these relationships are often species specific. So there's a huge potential for protist diversity. So that's mainly just to say that we aren't sure about the diversity of the protist, kind of like bacteria. We just haven't discovered them all, and it would be impossible to. Protists are microscopic and unicellular. Protozoans are microscopic and unicellular. So I don't see it written in the slides this way. So let me just go ahead and tell you. A protist is classified loosely into algae or protozoans. Now, if we were in lab in a face-to-face class, we would take a drop of pond water and we would find the little creatures swimming around in the pond water under the microscope. And those are protozoans. They are unicellular, they are microscopic, but they are much larger than bacteria. In fact, a lot of them feed on bacteria. There are some multicellular forms of protist, and those multicellular forms are the algae. Not all algae. Some algae are unicellular. A few protists live as colonies that behave in some ways as a group of free-living cells, and in other ways as a multicellular organism. So we have some colonial protists, and algae can be in that category as well. You can have unicellular algae, you can have colonial algae, and then you can have multicellular algae like seaweed. So other protists are composed of enormous multinucleate single cells that look like amorphous, that means no shape, blobs of slime, So these are known as the plasmodial or cellular slime molds. Um, so they're more like fungus, but they're not classified. A lot of the protista have similarities with the animals or the plants or the fungi, or even similarities among two of those groups. Um, but the algae are not classified as plants because they don't have true plant structures, and the fungi, the protozoans, or the colonial slime molds that resemble fungi, are not classified as fungi because they don't have some of the structures that it takes to be classified as a fungus. But we always say, we say that protists are animal-like or plant-like or fungus-like, because they'll have something in common with one or more of those three groups. As far as protection for the cell, um, for the unicellular protist, they may have just a cell or plasma membrane like animal cells. They may have cell walls, plant-like cell walls composed of cellulose. And some are encased in glassy silica-based shells. Some really beautiful protozoans called diatoms, and make really pretty micrographs or photographs that are taken of the diatoms under the light microscope. Some are wound with pellicles of interlocking protein strips. The pellicle is like a coat of armor. So we typically classify protozoans based on two things, based on how they move and how they obtain food. So what we're looking at here are probably the three most commonly studied protozoans in college biology, general biology classes. You will be looking at these in your lab activity as well. Um, so the paramecium is an animal-like protozoan, and it moves by using cilia, which are little hairs on the outside of its body. The amoeba moves very, very slowly along a surface. It basically changes shape and glides along the surface. Each one of these little extensions are called pseudopods, or false feet, fake feet. And you really just have to watch an amoeba move to understand how they move. We typically just call it amoeboid movement. So make sure to pay attention to the video, any videos that show amoeboid movement. And there should be at least one in your lab activity, and there's definitely going to be one in the resources in this chapter. And then the euglena is really interesting because the euglena moves by a tail called a flagellum, similar to a sperm. But notice the color, it's green, and it contains these green organelles called chloroplasts. So a euglena is animal-like and plant-like. It can actually eat food like an animal, and it can also make its own food like a plant. So these are really interesting. Protozoans are very interesting to study under the microscope. Um, the metabolism of the protozoan is the other way that we classify them. They can be aerobic or anaerobic. Remember, if they're aerobic, then they live off of oxygen, and if they're anaerobic, then they carry out like fermentation instead of aerobic cellular respiration. Protists that store energy by photosynthesis belong to a group of photoautotrophs. And a lot of these are algae, and they do have chloroplast. But if you go back to the euglena is a mixotroph. because it does have chloroplast, so it can be photoautotrophic, meaning it can make its own food by sunlight. But if sunlight is not available, it can be a heterotroph and consume food from its environment. Heterotrophic protists, protozoans, consume organic materials such as other organisms like bacteria to obtain nutrition. Saprobes absorb nutrients from dead organisms or their organic waste. So a good example of saprobes, fungi are saprobes. So another good example of a saprobe is the slime molds that we're going to study that are actually not technically fungus, but they're similar to fungi. All right, so the way the amoeba obtains food is by phagocytosis. You may remember this word from Bio 111, and it happens when the plasma membrane or cell membrane engulfs a food particle, such as a bacterial cell or just any food particle. It engulfs that food particle and then brings it into its cytoplasm in a food vacuole. And that food vacuole is just a membrane that actually pinches off of the plasma membrane. That food is then digested when a lysosome fuses with the food vacuole, and then the digested waste is released by exocytosis. Amoebas feed by phagocytosis. That's one good example. Most protists undergo asexual reproduction, such as, like bacteria, binary fission. And sometimes, like the paramecium can divide by binary fission. Slime molds exhibit multiple fission and simultaneously divide into many daughter cells, similar to how the zygote that the very first cell that formed us, the one that when your dad's sperm met your mom's egg, that became a zygote, and that from that cell it started dividing into a ball of cells, and then it ended up producing you. Well, that's kind of how these slime molds multiply, many cells dividing at one time. And some reproduce by a process called budding. They produce tiny buds that eventually pinch off from the parent and become their own organism. There is sexual reproduction in protozoans that involves meiosis, and it involves fertilization. Most protozoans can switch from asexual to sexual reproduction when necessary. So often sexual reproduction happens when the environment, like nutrients are depleted, or the environment changes. There's not enough shelter, or there's not enough, maybe the temperature is different, the pH is different. Something happens that makes the environment more dangerous and difficult to live in. So sexual reproduction happens because it creates diversity. And if you have organisms that are clones of each other, if one of them dies, then the rest are likely to die. But if you have organisms with differences, with diversity, diverse traits, some will have a better chance of survival than others. So sexual reproduction is often associated with these environmental changes and when resources are low. Okay, so often when protozoans undergo sexual reproduction, they will also form a cyst, and that cyst is a way for the protozoan to go dormant for a certain time. And this is especially important whenever the environment is changing, and it allows them to wait out until the conditions become more favorable for survival.